Well, everybody, January may be over, but we've still got a lot more winter to go because it's officially February. Or should I say, Febu-scary? Thank you very much. I know I'm a master of comedy. But anyways, I'm here today to talk about 10 more of the best and most underrated winter horror movies. Some of these movies just happen to take place in winter, but with some of them, the snowy weather is a big part of the storyline. As usual, none of these movies are in any kind of order, but number one is my personal favorite. Also, just like in my previous video, I will be discussing one film that I've already talked about on my channel in the past, but I regret not giving it the number one spot on my list, and it's also one of my top 10 favorite horror movies of all time, so I wanted to revisit the film and talk about why I love it so much. Now with all that being said, let's begin our list. Butterfly Kisses. A filmmaker discovers a box of videotapes depicting a disturbing student film project known as The Peeping Tom. As he sets out to prove the footage is real, he becomes obsessed and will stop at nothing to reveal the truth. This movie has so many different layers to it. There's the first layer, which is about two friends doing a film project about this urban legend known as the Peeping Tom. And the myth is basically if you stare down a certain tunnel for an hour straight without blinking, then a dark figure will appear, and every time you blink from then on, he gets closer and closer until he eventually gets close enough to kill you. And the second layer of this movie is about a man who finds that footage from the two filmmakers and becomes obsessed with it. He believes it's real and is hellbent on trying to convince people that it's real and not just a fake. He hires a documentary film crew to follow him on his journey to find proof and evidence or anything at all that will prove that the footage is real and that he isn't just obsessed and losing his mind. This movie is absolutely terrifying in more ways than one. I mean, it's really scary with the extremely realistic depiction of obsession, but also the ghostly Peeping Tom is horrifying and literally made me scream out loud at one point. I know with found footage films, there's usually not a lot of hits, but a ton of misses. But this one is incredible, so I highly recommend watching Butterfly Kisses. The Chill Factor. A snowmobiling trip turns into a waking nightmare for a group of friends when they take refuge inside an abandoned summer camp that, unknown to them, was once used by a satanic cult. So yeah, this movie is basically about a group of friends snowmobiling and then one of them gets hurt very badly, so they find an abandoned campground and decide to stay there until they can get their friend help. And while they stay there, they find a Ouija board and decide to play with it. And then of course, one of them gets possessed. This movie reminded me a lot of Ghost Keeper, mixed with a little bit of Friday the 13th. It's a cheesy, slow burn 80s slasher, mixed with some supernatural elements as well. And I really liked the cabin at the abandoned summer camp as well. It made for a very creepy, yet oddly cozy environment. A decent amount of this movie is narrated by one of the main characters, and it was actually one of my favorite aspects of the film. The story is very beautifully told, almost like someone telling a scary campfire story, but it was actually really poetic as well. Snowmobile riding can be really fun, but if you get hurt, it turns into a disaster. So instead of going snowmobiling, stay home and watch The Chill Factor. The Retreat. Two best friends, Gus and Adam, set out for a winter backpacking trip through the mountains. But after a horrifying encounter with a monster, Gus finds himself alone and lost in the forest. Now he must fight for his life while keeping his grip on reality, as he's tormented both physically and psychologically by the evil Native American legend, the Wendigo. This is a creature feature, but it's also very much a psychological horror film that messes with your head. It keeps jumping around from different points in time and alternate realities with different outcomes. It's a really cool idea, but I'll be honest, it got pretty confusing. But I am a big fan of any type of story involving the Wendigo, and the creature designs were pretty cool and creepy. Plus, the snowy forest made for a great, chilly setting for the film. So if it's a cold, snowy day, then cover up with blankets and turn on the heat. Then sit back and watch The Retreat. Orphan. First Kill. After orchestrating a brilliant escape from a psychiatric facility, Esther travels to America by impersonating the missing daughter of a wealthy family. So this is obviously a prequel to the first film, but it does contain spoilers for that movie. So if you haven't seen the first film, then you probably shouldn't watch this one until after you've seen it. I was very pleasantly surprised that this movie kept with the same snowy aesthetic that the first film has. And just like in the first movie, this one has another giant, super surprising plot twist, and I was extremely shocked when it happened. And thankfully, they brought back the same actress who played Esther in the first film, and once again, I was completely blown away by how fantastic she is. She does such an incredible job at playing this character, and I'd really love to see more of her in the future. I hope we get at least one more sequel, so we can have a full Orphan trilogy, because I really love these movies a lot. So if you don't want to go outside and you just want to stay home and chill, then I recommend watching Orphan. First Kill. We're all going to the World's Fair. Reality and fantasy begin to blur when an isolated teenager immerses herself in an online role-playing horror game. This movie is very similar to The Gallows Act 2. I know I'm probably the only person who really loves that movie. I know most people don't even know they made a sequel to The Gallows, but the plot of the sequel is basically the same plot of this movie. A lonely girl seeking approval and recognition does this YouTube challenge, and then weird things start happening to her, and she doesn't know if she's being haunted or just losing her mind. I personally think The Gallows Act 2 is a much better film, but We're All Going to the World's Fair takes the idea in a completely different direction, and is more psychological, I think. I related to the main character in this movie a lot, because they are a very shy, insecure person who loves horror movies, and is just looking for not necessarily attention, but more so validation or friendship, or just any reason to keep living. Also, this movie has some really great ambiance. It was very moody and expressive. So if you're looking for a horror movie filled with scares and despair, then I recommend watching We're All Going to the World's Fair. The Frankenstein Theory. Professor John Venkenheim leads a documentary film crew to the rim of the Arctic Circle, in a desperate effort to find proof and validate his theory that the famous novel Frankenstein is not a work of science fiction, but of science fact. So I know by hearing the description of this film, you probably think it sounds like the dumbest movie ever. I know it sounds really silly and ridiculous, but it was surprisingly a really good movie. And the characters in the film also know that the whole idea of searching for Frankenstein is ridiculous. But when stuff actually does start happening, it's admittedly very scary. Overall, this film has a really cool, well-executed concept, and is a very unique, fresh take on the classic story of Frankenstein's monster. So if you're interested in watching a creative found footage film that's spooky and eerie, then I recommend watching The Frankenstein Theory. Dark was the night. When a logging company decimates a forest in a small town, the sheriff and his deputy must confront the violent and unexplainable events that follow. This movie is extremely similar to The Wolf of Snow Hollow. Both films are about small-town sheriffs dealing with a lot of stress and anxiety, and then the people in town start getting attacked and murdered, and everyone believes there's some supernatural creature involved, but the sheriff refuses to give in to the paranoia. So in this movie, after an entire forest gets cut down, strange things start happening. Animals start going missing, people start getting attacked, and one morning when the sheriff wakes up, he finds a trail of hoof prints that goes throughout the entire town. And that part of the movie is actually based on a true story known as The Devil's Footprints. In February of 1855, there was a mysterious event that occurred in South Devon, England, where overnight, hoof-like footprints appeared all over the area. The footprints were everywhere. They were even found on the tops of snow-covered roofs. I love any type of horror movie based on real-life events, especially disturbing unsolved mysteries like this one. And the last half hour of this movie is badass. It has a very intense and cinematic ending. So if you're looking for a frosty creature feature that will fill you with fright, then I recommend watching Dark Was the Night. Witches in the Woods. 7 friends head off to a ski resort for a weekend of fun. But on the way, their car breaks down in the middle of nowhere. With temperatures falling and their nerves on edge, strange things start happening, and they aren't sure what to believe or who to trust. First thing I want to say is that the name of this movie is very misleading. It makes it sound like the movie is about a coven of witches living in the forest, but we don't ever see any witches. We just get told that there were some people who got accused of being witches, and they were hung for it. Very similar to the Salem witch trials. And now the witches may or may not be haunting the woods. But like I said, we never actually see any witches. This movie is what I would call a paranormal, paranoia, psychological horror movie. Nothing is really ever confirmed one way or the other. I personally think one of the characters was possessed by the dead witches, but like I said, it's really all left up to interpretation. I've seen some people who think the movie was more about mass hysteria rather than possession. Overall, it doesn't matter if this movie was paranormal or psychological. I still really enjoyed it and thought it was very good. So I highly recommend watching Witches in the Woods. Ginger Snaps Back, the Beginning. In early 19th century Canada, orphan sisters Ginger and Bridget find themselves lost in a forest while riding on horseback. They're rescued by a hunter who takes them back to his home, but something strange has happened there. The few settlers who remain are suspicious of outsiders and keep quiet about the situation, but Ginger soon discovers their secret for herself. So this is the third and final movie in the Ginger Snaps trilogy, and I actually really enjoyed this movie. It reminded me a lot of Sleepy Hollow. It just has that same look and vibe, and visually it looks like it was directed by Tim Burton. And I think it's really funny that even though this film takes place in the 19th century, Bridget and Ginger still act and speak exactly like they normally do, constantly telling people to fuck off and being sarcastic as always. This film also has some really great cinematography and a very pretty snow-covered landscape. And the ending is honestly so beautiful and fitting and extremely poetic. It's a wonderful ending to the Ginger Snaps trilogy. So if it's a cold winter night and you want to watch a beautiful, eerie movie that will leave you grinning, then I recommend watching Ginger Snaps Back, the Beginning. And now, the #1 movie on my list, and one of my favorite movies ever made, the #1 best winter horror movie of all time is The Blackcoat's Daughter. During the dead of winter, a troubled young woman travels to an isolated prep school where 2 stranded students are being stalked by a mysterious evil entity. So I have talked about this movie on my channel once in the past, but since then, this movie has really grown on me, and I've come to love it and appreciate it even more. In fact, it's easily one of my top 10 favorite horror movies ever, and I didn't feel like I did it justice the first time I talked about it, so I really wanted to talk about it again. The Blackcoat's Daughter, which was originally titled February, is written and directed by Oz Perkins, who also directed Gretel and Hansel, which is another fantastic movie that I plan on discussing in the future. And this movie stars Emma Roberts, Kiernan Shipka, and James Remar, all of whom are incredible actors and give outstanding performances. I love them all, but Kiernan Shipka is specifically spine-chilling in this movie. This film is ultimately about loss and loneliness, and it perfectly captures the feeling of emptiness and complete despair. It's a very dark and dreary movie, with horror elements that are genuinely horrifying and disturbing. It doesn't feel cheap or fictional. This movie is extremely moody and atmospheric, with some beautiful snowy scenery and a very creepy location and setting. There's this genuinely unsettling feeling of isolation and absolute coldness. In fact, this movie was actually filmed in February and the weather was 35 degrees below zero. All of the actors were freezing. The cinematography in this movie is absolutely beautiful, but at the same time, it feels very bleak and melancholy. Also, the soundtrack is beautiful and mesmerizingly haunting. This is an extremely eerie, atmospheric, moody, chilling film. It's very different from any other horror movie I've seen before, but I mean that in the best way possible. It's dark and gritty, gloomy and ominous, sinister and unsettling. I could honestly go on and on about how much I love this movie. Every single aspect of this film is perfect. So overall, I have to say that The Blackcoat's Daughter is an absolute masterpiece. So if you're tired of watching cliché slashers filled with slaughter, then I recommend watching The Blackcoat's Daughter. Well, everybody, that's the end of my list. I hope you enjoyed it. And if it's snowing where you live, don't go outside in the storm, stay inside where it's warm. Until next time, remember, always be prepared to get scared.